Well, Matt Poole spent a career in the US Department of Defense's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He's also an aviation historian and author. His particular area of expertise is 159 Squadron and RAF Liberator activities against the Japanese during World War II. So, hello, Matt.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Good evening.
Thanks for agreeing to talk with us. I know you're based on the American East Coast, so I hope we've not got you too.
Oh, well, you know, it's a brutal hour of 10 a.m. here. I don't know how anyone can function so early, but no.
Well, just before we get into the story itself, I'll just explain the slightly unusual circumstances behind how we came to feature the story in Airmail. I think it was back in April, sometime back in April, the Airmail team, Andy and I, were discussing what content we'd need for the July issue. And what we really wanted was something to mark, in some way, the upcoming 75th anniversary of VJ Day. So, to cut a long story short, my research led me to you, Matt, who was the author of RAF Liberators over Burma. I think that was published about 3 years ago, was it?
Yeah, it was came out in November of 2017.
Yeah. Well, we discussed a few ideas around that book, didn't we, to begin with, maybe featuring an extract from that book.
Yeah, that was the idea, yeah.
In one of your emails, we've shared many emails now, in one of them, you attached a very short Word document, I think it was. And I remember you saying, don't feel any obligation to read this. It's kind of related to the story I tell in the book. But I'm happy to go with the book extract. This is just in case you're interested. So I opened that Word document, intended to have a brief 2-minute scan of what was in there. And about 15-20 minutes later, having read and reread it again a few more times, what was actually really a short summary of the main story. I know we had to get you to tell this instead. So for those viewers that haven't yet read Daring Diana, or maybe have read it a few weeks ago when the article first came out, can you just give us a brief summary of what the article is and your story?
Sure. My mother, Jessie Poole, is from Liverpool, and she met her first husband, George Plank, in an air raid shelter. They were both out about on a night during a bombing attack by the Luftwaffe, and they met and started dating. And they'd meet at the air raid shelter. And George eventually, they were both 17. Eventually, when he was 18, he joined as a volunteer, Royal Air Force, went off to training as a wireless operator air gunner. It took him Blackpool, Yatesbury, air gunnery school in Stormy Down, Wales, Harwell. And they were going to get married when the time was right. And George couldn't get leave to go to his own wedding. And Mom's father, my grandfather, a World War I veteran, called up the CO and arranged for George to get leave. At 2 in the morning, he made it to Liverpool the day of his wedding. Everything came off perfectly. It was a blast. He went back to war, he wasn't in war yet. He was still training, finishing at 15 Operational Training Unit at Harwell. 6 weeks later, he flies off to India. And in no time, after only 9 ops with 159 Squadron on 4 engine Liberators, missing in action, missing, no known details. They flew at night and he was gone, just like that, but missing. Imagine the open-ended wound from being the loved one of a missing man. And we knew that as kids. I was one of 5 kids. My mother eventually moved to America when she met my father in Aruba, and they married in 1949. She was far away from England and raised a family, but we all knew who George was, but Mom didn't know anything. So when I moved to Washington, 50th anniversary of World War II, here, there, and many different anniversaries, the idea of George's past was rekindled, and I asked my mother, can I investigate? And I expected it to be a 1-letter investigation, and she was all for it. And my father's second husband, all for it, which was great. 1 letter to the Air Historical Branch set me off, because it provided me with the names of 2 crews. I didn't know it. 2 liberators were shot down. I had 2 crews. I had the name of the 159 Squadron Association. And I wrote, and they answered. And these men came out of the woodwork to help me when they didn't have to. And the brain started going, and I befriended many different men of a different generation. And Stan Sampson, the secretary of 159 Squadron Association, put me in touch with Don Lomas, who was one of the last survivor of the men who were shot down. He was on the other aircraft, not George's. He was a POW survivor. And so I just met, I was in heaven, really. It was more than one could hope for.
And was it difficult to get the veterans of the 159 Squadron to talk to you, or were they ready?
No,
they were ready to open up and discuss some of
they
their
were ready,
experiences?
and I think the timing was extraordinary. Men who hadn't talked their entire lives in some cases, who could you talk to? The wife, the children? They weren't there. They didn't know. I showed an interest. I had a family connection with my mother, having lost her first husband. Even though I was a bloody Yank, I was still essentially British or Australian or whatever. They weren't all from Great Britain. And they opened up. They realized I'd been bottled up for years. Now I can talk. They'd go to their old boy meetings like 159 Squadron Association. Some of them discovered, oh, now I can talk. And the burden was released. And I was part of that, release. And they opened their arms to me and helped me and fed me information. Eyewitness accounts from Don Lomas, who didn't have to be my great friend, but he chose to. And I was just in the right place at the right time. It was fantastic. And I'm sorry, George missing, his name went on the Kranji Memorial to the missing in Singapore. Mom knew this, but so we knew a few things, but is that enough? Not really. I wondered, was it a fighter attack? So I was standing in line in Alexandria, Virginia to meet American fighter aces one Saturday. I met someone behind me. We were just chatting. He was another collector, researcher. He took my name. He had a library of books, and he said, well, one day maybe you'll come over and we'll talk about mutual interests. It was 2 years later, he writes to me, and I asked him, do you know anything about the Far East? He was moving and he was selling things off. Do you know anything about the aviation of over Burma? Well, I have this one partial English translation of a Japanese language book. It's the only thing I have. Yeah, sure, take it with you. I happen to have it. It's just a few pages typewritten with typos. And at 2 in the morning, I couldn't sleep. And I'm just looking through the thing. It has biographies of all the top Japanese Army Air Force aces. And Bunichi Yamaguchi over Rangoon on the 29th of February, 1944. He and Hiroshi Takaguchi shoot down 2 bombers. What? This is too good. This is par for the course for my research, by the way. Things just fell into my lap. But I had the names of 2 men who I was guessing had shot down George, whose plane was Daring Diana. I don't think I said that. Daring Diana and Pegasus were the 2 liberators from 159 Squadron that were shot down.
So everyone aboard Daring Diana was killed, weren't they? But there were a few survivors from Pegasus.
Yeah, from Pegasus, 6 were captured. They bailed out. And but George died. But Mom didn't know that. No one knew that. Were they prisoners? Mom had decided George was alive because he had said he would come back from the war, and she believed him. and another wartime fiancée of one of the other men on the plane, she believed that her Bernard, who she was about to marry, was alive. And for years, she was in the Red Cross and she would visit men who had amnesia. On her own money, she'd travel hundreds of miles thinking this might be Bernard, and it never was. And she finally moved on. But so I had a name, two names, Yamaguchi, Takaguchi. One was a 19 kilays, the other a 9 kilays. Takaguchi died in the war. Yamaguchi, how could I possibly find him? But I had a name, and through my contacts, I linked to a Japanese retired General Yuzuru Kochiyama, who was a pilot in the Second World War and a historian now. I wrote to him, and he wrote in English, which was a godsend. And he said, "I'll be seeing Mr. Yamaguchi next week." Come on, come on. And I was able to write Yamaguchi, and he answered all of my questions, as he didn't have to. But not only that, he went out of his way to apologize to my mother for killing her first husband, George Plank. He prayed for her happiness. He said, "Please show her this letter. It may amount to nothing, but I hope it makes a difference and the rest of her life is a little bit less burdened." That's remarkable. His letter came in Japanese. I couldn't have read it. Here it is. I don't know if you can see it. Just Japanese. I can't read it. But it arrived maybe the week of the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And on TV, all the big networks here had 2-hour specials, the 50th anniversary. And they interviewed one of them, Don Gorham, translator who grew up in Japan, but he was American and he came back to America. Wow, interesting. And then I found that the Navy version of the book in Japanese, where I had found Yamaguchi's name, the Navy version was published with the translation. And who's in the back of the book? Don Gorham. There's his picture with his biography, and it says Silver Spring, Maryland. That's where I live. I looked him up in the phone book. He's right there. He goes to church right near my house. He said, "Just give me a coffee and I'll come over and translate for free. This is a great honor." And that's how I learned Yamaguchi's spectacular recital of facts of the 29th of February and his apology.
Yeah, we printed some of the apology in the Daring Diana article.
Yeah.
What else did he say in his letter?
He told me what happened on the 29th of February, how he and Takaguchi went airborne and attacked from behind with cooperation of the searchlights. And but he also talked about he was the only survivor of his squadron, pilot to survive from the initial formation of the squadron until the end of the war. There was terrible attrition naturally with the losing side. And he also sent me a copy of the actual award he received the next morning for shooting down George. I don't know if it's upside down. Here it is. It was printed like that in one publication, but it goes like that. And behind me on the floor, I have the actual certificate, because when he died suddenly, his son gave it to me, which is spectacular. Let's see, I've got to undo my earbuds for just a second here. I'll just hold it up. And there it is. It's, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I'll put it down now, but, it spells out what happened, and he knew of it. He and the other pilot became celebrated. It was broadcast on the radio. It was in the propaganda newspaper on page 1 in Rangoon, printed in English, the language of business at the time.
And were they given the award because it was quite uncommon to be able to shoot down 2 liberators?
Right. Yes, it
night?
was. It hadn't happened. At night, you think over Europe, it was a different scale of war. Not over Burma. There were very few aircraft lost at night. Yamaguchi talked about December 1st, 1943, there was a big daytime American attack. And the Americans who were, they thought, our planes, they're bristling with guns, no one will shoot us down. But they were decimated. I think they lost all of 6 aircraft, which anyone who flew over Europe Bomber Command would laugh at, because the numbers were a little bit higher there. It was a different scale of war. Mr. Yamaguchi was shot down that day, was injured on December 1st, but it was the last daytime attack for a while. And the British at the time went at night, just like they did over in Bomber Command, round the clock, Americans by day, British at night.
So when you got the letter translated from Mr. Yamaguchi, how did you feel when you actually read the English translation? Because it's not a typical letter to get, is it?
No. Well, Don Gorham, who translated, he stopped, he turned to me and said, "This is an extraordinary man. He's a cut above the rest." Not everyone would do that. And if you know, the Japanese culture is one where often you have to have introductions. It's very hard to communicate. There has to be a sense of protocol to introductions. And I didn't quite go that route. I had General Kochiyama to help out. That was a much appreciated link. But Bonichi Yamaguchi opened up to me anyway, and put things in a long letter that he didn't have to write to me, which, floored me, floored my mother. When I read that he was apologizing, it changed her life. I didn't realize that even though she'd given me the green light to research, and so did my father, I didn't realize my mother was suffering nightmares. For the first time in her life, she knew that George really died. Before that, as a young war widow, she decided, well, he's alive, but he's in Australia with amnesia. Something like that. And that's a coping mechanism. During the war, actually, she was known as Joan. She and her girlfriend changed their names on the day the Second World War began. Young girls growing up. I'm Joan from now on. And actually, George called her Joan, but eventually she abandoned the name Joan and went back to Jessie. And her sister said years later, that's because maybe you were it's one way of putting the past behind you. You're no longer Joan, which is associated with tragedy. Now you're Jessie and you can move forward. But there was still tragedy when she hadn't grieved. And I come along many decades later and reopen up the old wounds, but she never let on to me. And I told her, please tell me, the last thing I want to do is hurt you. She kept quiet. And Yamaguchi's letter helped just dissipate that sadness. And it was pride, and she was 2 inches taller for the rest of her life. And she died 5 years ago on her terms, proud of her past, proud of George. It was spectacular, really was.
So I know that your mother didn't really know what happened to George from the time he went missing until you found out. But that topic of conversation, was it freely talked about in your household when you were growing up?
It was, because I was the middle of 5 kids, and Mom, but there was so little to tell us. We loved stories of England. She grew up in Liverpool until she was I don't know, until 1949, she was English, and she came to America. We moved to Wilmington, Delaware from Illinois when the Beatles broke. On our street, which was all World War II families, which meant 1,000,001 kids. The Beatles were huge and lots of teenage girls, etc. My mother was a star attraction because she was from Liverpool. So we knew Liverpool, we knew her past, but she knew so little, but she didn't hide it. She wasn't one of those people who said directly, that's the past, let's move on. But she knew nothing. And that's why when I started learning things, Air Historical Branch, Eric Munday, wonderful gentleman who I'd read about at the Air Historical Branch, he's the one who had written me far more than he had to. He gave me a copy of the 159 Squadron report that was filed immediately after the aircraft losses. They knew nothing, so it was bare bones, but it listed the 2 crews, ranks, service numbers. So mom knew little, the RAF knew little. I was told by the RAF and by Commonwealth War Graves Commission, no known graves, no crash sites ever found. All right. Despite that, I still had so much to research and find out. And it exploded. And the fact that everyone embraced me and fed me information when they didn't have to just made it so much easier. And travel, travel. I went to England for the first time in '91 and was met at Heathrow Airport by a legendary bomber pilot who flew two tours. You know, Bomber Command will say, 2 tours, they're a dime a dozen. But he was, you know, braver than brave, and he drove me around and drove me to his old wireless operator's house in Horsforth. And that was Bill Kirkness, whose memoir years later I turned into a book and added to. But I'm going to grab it. This isn't self-promotion, I swear. But on the cover, there's a Liberator. That was one from 159 Squadron. The same picture is in the article. Is this backwards, by the way? Or can you read it?
We see it.
Okay. Yeah, it's backwards to me. That's okay. Johnny Gauntlet is that tall gentleman in the back row there. He's the one who met me at the airport, drove me around, fed me information. At night, we'd go over his logbook. And then he drove me to Bill Kirkness's house in Horsforth. And Bill was Don Lomas's mate, Don, who was wireless operator, beam gunner on Pegasus, who was shot down, survived Rangoon jail. And I had just made contact with him. And Bill knew him and loved the man. They were friends. But they hadn't seen one another since right after the war. That happens all the time. So when I visited Bill, he and his wife drove to Don Lomas's in Mytholmroyd, West Yorkshire, near Hebden Bridge, where the Bronte sisters came from. And old mates seeing one another for the first time in decades, and I witnessed it. And then that spurred their memories. Remember this, remember that? And I had my tape recorder. So I captured it all and was able to interview Don. And my foot was in the door. You know,
so all this research was to try and find out what happened to George at this point, wasn't it? But so can you tell us how you got from that to going down on a quite a prolonged tangent to something which resulted in a book about someone else? Because they knew each other, did they, Bill and George? Yeah. Bill had told me. Well, Don played boogie woogie piano he was a sergeant, flight sergeant, in the sergeant's mess, but he would be invited to the officers' mess to play piano, and they'd ply him with alcohol. And I now have a copy of Don's diary, and he says, tight, you know, these little one word, little room to write anything to summarize the day, but he'd say, officers' mess at night, tight.
No, he was drunk. They were plying him with beer and booze, what little they could get out there. But so Don and Bill, fellow wireless operators, they had interacted in their profession on the ground. They were in different flights, A flight and B flight of 159 Squadron, but they knew one another. So they, I was bringing people together. And I went to a 159 Squadron reunion, and everyone wanted to hear the stories. And then they tell me theirs, and my knowledge base grew and grew and grew. And then the internet opened up 1997 for me. There are chat rooms and things and databases online that were never online before. People contacting me for help because I had an email address now. And so it exploded, and Curious Matt couldn't hold back. And I started wanting to help other people learn about their projects or their uncle who was missing. Or I'd see another case of a liberator where the crew is missing, no known grave. But I found out, no, they came down on land. There were bodies. Somebody knows. And I researched and I found the most amazing things. What good is it doing me? What good is it doing just me? So I reached out and used the internet to find loved ones, wartime fiancés, brothers, sisters, wives, widows, children even. If you're interested, I have the answer. I never forced anything on anyone that I know of. And almost everyone said, we've been waiting 50, 60 years.
George Plank was your mother's first husband, and you are the son of her second husband.
Yes.
And so there's no blood relation between you and him.
None.
How do you feel about him now? Do you feel as though he's almost a stepfather, or what's the relationship?
Well, it's, he's related to me. He's part of my soul. He died 12 years before I was born. So I'll never know him, but I know all about him. I have photos of him. I've seen his picture on his name on a memorial in Singapore, and so on. I've heard heartfelt apologies for having killed him from Yamaguchi. I know my mother's emotions, so it's part of me. So but even though I'll never know him. He's like a stepfather. I don't see him as a father figure, no. But I joke with people, if not for Yamaguchi, maybe I would have been raised in Liverpool and my name would be Nigel, I wouldn't have been, a career federal government employee in America. I wouldn't be talking to you right now. But that's history. We're all molecules colliding, and who knows how many times the falling meteorite has missed me. That's just the reality of daily living. So, but George, and all these people, and I look at them. I've got to say, I look at them as larger than life, larger. There, but for the grace of God, go I. I've never been through anything like these nobodies in many cases, from broken families, from small, impoverished families. Suddenly they were seeing having their photos taken in front of the Sphinx, or going to India, exotic India, the good, the bad, and going off to war, serving for the good of others. What have I done that compares? I'm small potatoes compared to each and every one of those men who went off to war, and of course the women. Trust me, I don't forget, and their loved ones back home. It was everyone. Just I'm filled with awe, filled with gratitude, filled with humility. I really am, and I hope others are also.
Thank you to Matt Poole for a fascinating interview. This is the end of the first half of an hour-long interview we recorded with Matt. The full version is on the Project to Entertain page of our website. You can also read Matt's articles in the July and October issues of Airmail magazine.